Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of the Eon Podcast. We are joined today by Razan Saffour, who is a British Syrian researcher, human rights activist, and she has over 13 years of experience in communications, advocacy, and the emergency response with regards to Syria. Razan, how are you feeling right now?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all.
You're welcome.
And Walaikum salam. I'm feeling a lot of things, a lot of mixed emotions right now. In the present moment right now, as we speak, the city of Hama is being liberated. The city of Hama is located more or less, it's located more closer to central Syria. If Hama is liberated, it allows access to Homs and to Damascus, and so it's very strategic. But Hama also has a very historical significance due to the 1982 massacre that took place in February 1982, where an estimated 40,000 people were killed in the space of 3 weeks. Prior to the massacre, the city was besieged for about 3 weeks by the Assad regime. Um, Forcing the civilians and the fighters in it at the time to succumb to Assad's regime, Assad's grip, who is the father of the incumbent Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. Um, and the fall of Hama at that time, the massacre, the death, the murder of 40,000 people, amongst them entire lineages, entire families and family trees were wiped out in the space of 3 weeks. Half of the town was desecrated and destroyed. A lot of the Islamic scholars, a lot of the Muslim scholars were wiped out. They were killed. They were martyred. Um, this had a huge impact on generally Syria after 1982. It forced Syria to become a kingdom of fear. People saw the brutality and the extent at which the Assad regime will um, essentially be brutal and be violent. And they thought that, okay, hang on a second, actually, this isn't worth it. We don't want to do this. And they ended up succumbing to the dictatorship and authoritarianism of the Assad regime. And so seeing Hama being liberated now, what is it, 44 years later? It's something out of the world. It's something completely out of the world.
You tweeted that, and I apologize, but considering that this is the public domain, I'm going to repeat what you said in English. You said that I have an interview in a quarter of an hour, and I can't stop crying. Oh God, make them steadfast. Oh God, grant them your overwhelming victory. You just tweeted that maybe half an hour ago, considering that the Hama liberation is happening as we speak. And you mentioned the massacre of Hama at the hands of Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad. So you tweeted this out and you felt a certain type of way, considering that your father has already been incarcerated at one point by the Hafiz al-Assad regime. Why do you feel so particularly emotional about Hama and the considering the context of the Hama massacre?
So, I'm not from Hama. My father's from Homs. My mother's from Aleppo, which just recently got liberated. Um, my father was detained between 1979 and 1980 several times before he ended up leaving Syria. Um, and he was incarcerated, he was detained, he was tortured. They broke his back, they broke his nose. He still has torture marks on his body. Um, and then from my mother's side, my uncles were detained. My grandfather was detained. I have an uncle who was tortured to death in prison. And I have another uncle who spent 17 years between Tadmur and Sadmaya. From 1981 or 82, and then he was released, I believe, just before 2000, 1999, or perhaps 1998. There's a mix in the dates when it comes to that. Um, but so people tend to assume that Hama was the only massacre that took place in Syria at that time, that Hama was a culmination of many smaller massacres. The Assad regime had made any opposition to them, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it was the communists, whether it was the socialists. There were a good number of people from different ideologies sort of standing against the Assad regime. Some of them were more civil, some of them became armed. Um, and the Assad regime responded by cracking down on all of this opposition. But it cracked down most brutally on those who had more of an Islamist background. It cracked down most brutally on those it perceived to be a bigger threat, because ultimately we're speaking about a conservative society, regardless of their ideology. Syria was primarily a conservative society made up primarily of Sunni Muslims who may be prone to an extent to an inclination of political leanings, whether it's political Islam or something else, but there is that inclination. And so the Muslim Brotherhood and other factions who sort of had this understanding of mixing Islam and politics together, they were most brutally cracked down upon. I actually conducted interviews with some of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood just last year and the year prior. I was writing a thesis on this, on them and basically their exile. And I was asking them questions about this period because for the most part, it hasn't been reported, it hasn't been recorded. And it was very interesting because a lot of their sentiments were they believed that the crackdown was actually on Sunni Islam, but the Muslim Brotherhood were used as a scapegoat because they happened to be the most organized and the more politically inclined of those groups. Whereas the Muslim groups that weren't so politically inclined, that were focused more just on the da'wah field or focused more just on the knowledge-seeking field or on the tasawwuf field, they tended to be left alone or not left alone, but they had some sort of I don't want to say agreement because it wasn't the fact that they were
It was
working
an
closely with the
implicit sort of
regime.
social, because I think what you're trying to say is that the overwhelming democratizing force of Sunni Islam in Syria was represented through the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of the political machinations, and with that they became the centralized target, but it allowed other smaller groups to sort of operate
Yeah,
under that umbrella.
yeah,
And
at the time.
at the time, yes.
And this, by the way, this reverberated across the entirety of the Arab world at the time. So when you look at it, the exact same time, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt were being cracked down upon, the exact same time, those in Algeria and Tunisia were being cracked down upon. So there is kind of like, there was like this theme where with the rise of Arab nationalist governments and that rise of Arab nationalist secular governments, or those that painted themselves to be secular, because I know that there's a lot of contention when it comes to us defining the terms of Islamist and secularism. A lot of the crackdown came down upon the Muslim Brotherhood because they were generally more organized at the time. And at the time, they also had more of a unified messaging. That's changed a lot since, but at that time, they had more of a unified messaging, which it rendered them a threat to a lot of these Arab regimes.
A lot of Syrian Muslims right now are inside and outside of Syria are, presented with a sign of hope, but a lot of them are cynical and skeptical as well. Uh, with the speed of how it's unfolded and the timing of it all, what do you make of Jolani, the speed with which it's happening? What are you getting from on ground? Because your family is still based out of Halab, a lot of it, yes?
I have an aunt in Halab, yes, and I have an uncle and his family in Homs.
Right. So, what is the messaging coming out of Syria? What is being discussed in the diaspora Syrian community? And do you think this is a sign of hope, or is the cynicism maybe justified?
The cynicism is definitely justified, and so there's no one like monolithic view on what's happening right now, and I think a lot of people are still very confused. Honestly, I don't. I'm still confused. Confused. I don't understand how this happened so fast. I don't have an answer for that, and I have a lot of fear that they're getting closer and closer, and they are liberating towns and cities. But are they going to be able to hold down? Because what is their capacity like? I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. And also right now we don't really have accurate reports on casualties. So we don't know how many people are being killed, how many soldiers are being killed. We don't know what's happening on that front like right now. And I assume that's very strategic on their behalf in order to keep people's morale up. But in terms of HTS, in terms of the SME, in terms of the coalition of Al-Fath al-Mubin right now, and this is the name of the coalition which is um, doing the liberation. There are a lot of mixed views, and there's a good level of both support and cynicism. There's a good level of both support and apprehension. On one hand, many Syrians are definitely in support of the act of resistance against the Assad regime. They're definitely in support of the act of liberating these cities from the Assad regime, from Iran, from Russia, from their clutches, because ultimately we perceive the main issue and the core issue in Syria being the Assad regime being in power. But what many are then conflicted upon is, do we actively support the actual rebel factions, given that we are aware of their backgrounds, given that they aren't perfect, definitely, given that HTS, and there are very, very valid concerns when it comes to HTS, HTS do stem from more of a radical background. They did denounce, so HTS ultimately stemmed from an Al-Qaeda background. They did denounce it in 2016. They have been working on reforms since then, and it's been hit and miss. They have been attempting to sort of nationalize themselves a lot more over the last few years. We've seen them adopt a much more Syrian rhetoric, a much more unifying rhetoric. In Idlib, which they ruled, de facto ruled for about 4 years, even before HABB, they were attempting to get closer and to kind of like showcase their tolerance to minorities and showcase that they want to build up a Syria which is for everyone, and that minorities essentially shouldn't be scared. And so they made significant relationships, worked in significant relationships with the Christian community in Idlib and the Druze community in Idlib. It wasn't perfect, but they have been working on both those fronts. Now, with the liberation of Aleppo, obviously a lot of people were afraid because Aleppo has a significant percentage of a Christian population, and as we know, Christmas is coming up in just a few weeks, and no one has any indication as to how HTS is going to act or how any of the other rebel factions are gonna act. And so there's been a lot of validated fears, and there's also been a lot of fear mongering. And they've been working side by side. The valid fears are by those who are actually experiencing this, and they have a very valid reason to assume.
Or genuine concern for the people of Syria.
Exactly. And then you also have people who are primarily pro-Assad or pro-Iran or pro-Russia, who are just attempting to paint from a very Islamophobic lens that these people are completely radical. Some people are from the axis of resistance, and some people are just pro-Russia. Like, it's crazy.
Speaking of the axis of resistance, do you really think that you, as a Syrian, feel that the Assad regime is genuinely anti-Israel?
It's a very layered question, but I think my answer is no. I think ultimately I believe, and this is my view, I believe that the Assad regime only cares about its survival. And so it will do whatever it needs in order to survive, whether that's collaborating with Israel, whether that's supporting in rhetoric Iran because it thinks that Iran will protect it. This is my view. The Assad regime hasn't actively actually fought against Israel in any capacity. The fact that it's actually part of the axis of resistance, which, as much as I dislike them, given their actions inside Syria, I can still understand, the ideology from which they stem, and it would be disingenuous of me to say that Iran and Hezbollah have not stood against Israel, But when it comes to the Assad regime genuinely has not done anything. Where Hezbollah has sent fighters to fight on the fronts, not as viciously as it sent fighters to fight against Syrians, but it has sent fighters, and it would be disingenuous for anyone to say otherwise. Where Iran is genuinely a threat to Israel, I don't believe because they believe in Palestinian liberation, but rather because they have, their own regional praxis, and they have their own regional geopolitical sort of visions that they want to enforce upon the region. Um, the Assad regime hasn't. Israel has been bombing Syria over the last 12 years. It's intensified more so in the last year. Over the last 12 years, primarily it would bomb Iranian weapon factories or Iranian weapon storages and depots. But obviously, there would be collateral damage. There would be civilians that would go in these bombings. In the last year, that has intensified. So Israel has been bombing certain areas in Damascus and Homs. Civilians have been killed at the same time. And the Assad regime used to at least say, we will respond at a time of, at the time that we want. They used to say, نحتفظ بحق الرد. They haven't even issued that anymore. Like they've stopped even issuing rhetorical, responses. Just a few months ago, the Israeli army conducted a raid inside Syria. The Israeli army, I think there were about 30 men. They conducted a raid in southern Syria, where they raided the house of an Iranian official within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And they detained him and they took them back to Israel. But it was crazy because the Assad regime didn't even issue anything. The Assad regime didn't say anything. We all found out about it about a month later when the Israeli media leaked videos of it. And it's crazy because if they hadn't said that this just took place in Syria, you would have assumed this was taking place in the West Bank. You would have assumed that this was taking place in occupied Palestine. And obviously, when we began saying this is what the Assad regime is doing, the Assad regime fanboys essentially began calling us Zionist collaborators. They began calling us liars, and it's just crazy. Anyone watching it would know that Bashar al-Assad has done nothing, or is doing nothing. What's also happening over the last few months is that Israel is redrawing the borders of the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, which are Syrian, which have been occupied since 1967, which Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad, his father, have done nothing over the last decades to reclaim, even though it is Syrian territory. The Israel has been redrawing those lines, and the Assad regime has been doing nothing. No defenses, no nothing.
I think this begs a very big question that you see on social media, especially here in Pakistan. The Iranian lobby is very strong in Pakistan, especially in media. We see that either you can be pro-Palestine or anti-Assad. You can't, be both. How fair is this characterization, and do you think that there is some reconciliation? Because I think the average viewer is not, some Assad fanboy or some, Axis of Resistance Red Stream guy. The average person is just trying to be morally consistent in that they want to be anti-imperialist, but at the same time they see that there is fortuitous for Israel that a potential resupplying route through Syria for Hezbollah is being cut off by the militia. That's not saying that the rebels or the militia that is coming in is going to be pro-Israel or is a Zionist ploy, but you can see how that language picks up quick. How do you, as a Syrian, reconcile and remain morally consistent, while being pro-Palestine but anti-Assad?
There's no reason for me to reconcile because the two causes are one and the same. The two causes are causes against oppression. The two causes are against occupation, against injustice. And ultimately, we believe that our liberations are tied together, whether it's from a national standpoint, whether it's from an Islamic standpoint.
Hamas recently, it's perfectly fine, by the way, for the audience. This is a very emotional time for Razan, so you guys have to be patient with her. It's been, if I can add something to that, do you think that Hamas issuing the statement sort of in support of the liberation that's been going on, is that not a sign for, and that's being glossed over by generally the Axis of Resistance media and people online?
Has Hamas issued?
Hamas has issued like a vague sort of statement in support of the liberation.
Honestly, I haven't seen that. What have they said?
The representative in Turkey from Hamas released a statement.
Oh, okay. So that wasn't an official statement. I saw that interview. That wasn't an official statement.
Right. That's
That
not an
was
official statement, but
him
they're also tiptoeing around
expressing
it.
his
Yeah,
view.
it's that's the
Yeah,
trick
they
around.
are.
Yeah.
They are tiptoeing around it. Um, Honestly, I don't know what to make of it. I I believe Hamas are put in a very precarious position because of their relation to Iran and Iran's relation to the Assad regime. Actually, ultimately, this entire question that you've asked me, the reason why people feel like they cannot reconcile between the liberation of Palestine and the liberation of Syrians is precisely because of Iran's disinformation. Iran has positioned itself as the liberator or the supporter of the liberation of Palestine. And through that, it's brought in the Assad regime because it supports the Assad regime, because for its own interests, the Assad regime should remain in power. And therefore, it has brought the Assad regime into the axis of resistance. And it's forced upon people this understanding that, in order to support Palestine, you must also support Bashar al-Assad because Bashar al-Assad is on our side and Bashar al-Assad is fighting against Israel.
I mean, what about the role of Iran and Hezbollah generally in the region as someone who's like a real life Syrian as opposed to some Pakistani or someone online, some Irani or someone else? How do you guys actually view the role of Iran and Hezbollah in the region? Because Qasem
So,
Soleimani, to some in Pakistan, would be a hero, you know?
Qasem Soleimani to many Syrians was a brutal murderer. Qasem Soleimani destroyed our country. It took Qasem Soleimani 3 years to regain Aleppo, the same Aleppo that just took the rebels 3 days. And he did so in such a vicious manner where over 31,000 people were killed over 4 years. 22,000 of those were civilians, and the rest were primarily of a military background. And this is from both regime and non-regime and rebel fighter sites. But in terms of civilians, 22,000 civilians killed over 4 years and millions displaced. My aunt was in Halab at the time of this, and she was caught up a lot between the infighting. She was caught up a lot in Russia's scorched earth policy, which was aiding Qasem Soleimani's sort of masterminding of regaining Aleppo. Aleppo being the second biggest city and sort of like the trade center of Syria. Iran and Hezbollah have been engaging in massacres, sectarian massacres in Syria since 2011. They've been engaging in they've been engaged in the Daraya massacre. They've been engaged in the sieges against the Syrians, the Madaya siege in Zabadani. They have ethnically cleansed certain cities and towns, such as Al-Qusayr, from its original inhabitants in order to, occupy it and allow its own people to live in it. So Iran and Hezbollah
So people from Iraq and Iran, basically?
Iraq, Iran, also Pakistan, also Afghanistan. Iran has a lot of mercenaries. And so you have a good number of people coming in. It often doesn't actually send its own people in. Like you also see that sort of racism or the level of supremacy that exists.
I'll tell you a joke about that. We have a militia called the Zanabiyun. They employ a lot of people from Pakistan in that. When some of them died in the Iraq-Iran war, they wouldn't let them get buried in Iran. They had to send them back because they didn't see them as racial equivalents. They had to send them back to Punjab or wherever they came from. There's a lot of funny incidents like that. Unfortunately, Pakistan and Afghanistan have been slightly more effective with dealing with the Irani proxy militias in terms of them coming back, because they also started creating trouble for us here locally as well. But it's funny that you mentioned that. One of the funniest videos I've seen is from back in the day. It's like black comedy almost. It's very sick, in fact, where there's a guy who's a Hezbollah fighter is interviewing a captured Sunni fighter, and he is a Pashtun, and he's being interviewed with the help of a Pashtun, a Pathan, Zainabiyun fighter. And that is one of the funniest conversations I've ever seen, because both of the fighters are not Arabs or Syrians or whatever. They're from Afghanistan or in the north of Pakistan, and the translator in between is a Hezbollah fighter. It's a very ridiculous sort of situation. But we've seen, by the way, in the Sunni rebels as well, there's Pakistanis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and
So the Sunni
Tajiks as
rebels
well.
are, yeah. So there are also Uyghurs, there are Chechens, there are Albanians. Um, they are primarily Syrians, but there's also a good number of people who are not Syrians, a good number of people who felt like it was their responsibility to come and fight up, to come and fight against the tyrant. Many people migrated to Syria or moved to Syria from about 2000, moved to Syria from around 2012. Some also did come to join the more radical groups, and after those radical groups were defeated, they either left or they embedded themselves in the existing sort of rebel groups. So some did come to join ISIS, some did come to join Al-Qaeda, both of which were defeated in Syria, again, primarily by the Syrian rebel groups. People often forget that ISIS fought Syrians before it fought anyone else. So also this accusation of Syrian opposition being ISIS is very strategic disinformation, which is being pushed by both Russia and Iran at the moment.
You mentioned the 20,000 civilians. I assume they were all Takfiri Wahhabis, and I'd already brushed them aside. 22,000 human beings just completely, vanished in my head. This is a very common framing device, by the way, used online. I've noticed that in the narrative war, that civilians died in such and they were Takfiri Wahhabis, as if that's it's very Israeli if you think about it. It's a very Israeli style.
It's like when Israel calls everyone in Gaza, anti-Semitic, calls them all terrorists. It's the exact same narrative.
Nazis,
so the irony,
Amalek, whatever.
Exactly. So the irony of it being deployed by the exact same people who are actually fighting against this disinformation in the Israeli context. There's a cognitive dissonance that's happening, and that has been happening, which we Syrians have been subjected to for the last 13 years. And where it's very clear to the same, headed person, to the same person, that this is hypocrisy. For some reason, for a lot of other people, they're not seeing it as hypocrisy. The moment you begin speaking about the US or Israel or, a more complex situation, they begin issuing these blanket statements, which is very damaging, but also just completely dehumanizing and ridiculous. Like, how are you speaking about a civilian population being Takfiris, being Salafis, being Wahhabis, who were all converted in the space of 3 years? So they weren't before 2011? Like, it's stupid. I'm sorry, there's no intellectual discourse when it comes to
for the sake of argument, they were all Takfiri Wahhabis. That doesn't justify the mass slaughter of a population. You could have actual Nazis, and you just can't slaughter massive civilian populations.
Absolutely. So there's also a level of Islamophobia when it comes to this.
Yes.
And we've seen this deployed. And we've seen this deployed on several levels. Like, even, for example, with the Muslim Brotherhood, when I spoke at the very beginning, there was discourse at the beginning, I remember, of the revolution, because there was so much disinformation pushed out against the Muslim Brotherhood. During 1982 and 2011, many people who were actually anti-Assad regime still bought that. They still, perceived them to be, I don't know, like a violent group. They still perceive them to be somewhat in the wrong, and they could be. There are opinions when it comes to that, but that doesn't justify the mass slaughter, the mass expulsion, the mass incarceration. What we saw in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s were over 40,000 people being killed in Hama massacre. We also had tens of thousands of people being killed in other massacres across Syria, in Halab, in Latakia, in Homs, in Idlib. We saw the incarceration of over 25,000 people at that time. We saw more than 100,000 people actually become displaced. They left Syria at the time, them and their families. So we're also speaking about huge numbers, but because they were primarily people who were either associated or from or shared the same ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, they became dehumanized in the eyes of other Arabs and other Syrians. So I remember when 2011 happened and people were trying to justify, they were just like, well, these people are not Muslim Brotherhood. And I remember sitting there being like, what if they were? So what if they were? They're still humans. And they're humans who've actually been through such a traumatic time, which many other people haven't been through. So there is a level of also Islamophobia when it comes to this. There's a level of kind of like dehumanization.
I think Islamophobia is not enough, because Islamophobia is more of a non-Muslim hatred or dislike towards Islam. There's a very specific thing you're talking about, and we have a word for it in Urdu, which is a hatred for the mullah, for the Maulvi. which is the Persian word for the religious, like sheikh. And so there's like a deep-seated, and this is a post-colonial phenomenon when we had the secularization of the Muslim world, and when we started making nation states, there was an archetype of it in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s of the religious, reviled figure. And you saw it with all the Ba'athist regimes, and you saw it in South Asia as well. We developed it much later on, where the religious individual, the conservative man, especially the conservative man. So the conservative female is an object of sexualization, and the conservative man is an object of, his body is not humanized, and he can be killed, he can be tortured. This idea of, drag them by their beards, and you saw that with the Syria. So for example, when we were fighting the war on terror in Pakistan, when we were helping the Americans against our Afghani brothers and sisters, there was a lot of hubbub and propaganda done by the Pakistani state about how they have big beards and they smell bad and you have to drag them by their beard. It's just a very weird dehumanizing tactic. I don't know if it translates well into English from
Absolutely
the stuff that happened here. You see a similar playbook with this takfiri Wahhabi thing. It's a very quick, buzzword that can get you to immediately, associate negative feelings with this whole group of human beings, who number in the millions. And you can immediately justify them being wiped out. So it's even more than Islamophobia. It's something that maybe it doesn't even exist in the Western world. It's very unique to the Muslim world, where you have a certain segment of Muslim society that hates conservative Muslims, that hates religiously devout Muslims. So I think Islamophobia doesn't do it justice. But I know exactly what you're talking about, by the way, because I lived through the Pakistani war on terror. I grew up.
And there's also, I remember speaking to my friends, so I have a few good Bengali friends, and they were telling me how the same case was with Jamaat-e-Islam in Bangladesh.
Yes.
The exact same sort of violence against them, the exact same stereotypes.
Even though the democratization revolution that happened is primarily spearheaded by the Jamaat-e-Islami right now. The Jamaat-e-Islami, so Bangladesh had particularly bad because they secularized when they separated from Pakistan. In Pakistan, it happened much more recently in the 2000s when we jumped in with the American war in Afghanistan. So prior to that, we didn't have such a severe anti-religious sentiment like in the 60s and 70s that you had in the Arab and North African world. So I know exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about. It's very easy to dehumanize people and just say, oh, we say the word Maulana. Yani, it's a way of saying sheikh or whatever. So yeah, I mean, even if there were Muslim Brotherhood, what difference does it make?
I think actually, interestingly, in the last year, a lot of the Gaza discourse has very positively impacted on this. It's forced a lot of people to humanize Palestinians. Everyone's seeing the level of violence and destruction caused by Israel. And then also Israel weaponizing, accusing everyone of being Hamas. And then also people seeing, the actions of Hamas, whether they agree with them or not, understanding that actually they are a legitimate resistance. You've seen just so many people even from the Western world, or so many people, even from the secular Arabs and people from a lot of my own friends who I remember used to be like, we'd always have fights, and we were like, they'd call me an Islamist, I would call them secularist, and would have all of these kind of like very heated arguments, because I tell them, regardless of what we are, we have to humanize people, And then I think what happened with Gaza, because everything was so televised and we were seeing so much happening at the same time, and the battle of narratives, which Israel did lose, it really, I think, positively impacted, or it's positively impacting on this discourse, where now people who maybe a year ago would have more easily brushed this aside as, oh, well, these are, radical elements, etc., are being forced to reckon with themselves. So I think there's also been this, I'm not sure if you've seen it also, but I feel like there has been this progression in the discourse.
Yeah, no, so classically, you would have been on either side. The religious types would have been like, Allahu Akbar, we've done it. It's happening. We're going to be free. The caliphate is coming back, whatever. And the other side would have been like, no, these are Wahhabi takfiris, these are radicals, this is Al-Qaeda 2.0, etc., etc. Now I have noticed that nobody is being swept away. The conversation, the dialogue is much more nuanced. even the conservatives, the religious types are much more trepidatious when they speak about this. They're thinking about it.
Mm.
They're trying to find out as much as they can. And on the other side, if somebody is, pushing Irani or Russian propaganda, they embarrass themselves now. They embarrass themselves because I think larger amounts of the audience on social media, on public platforms, developing the narrative, they're not buying it anymore. They're not buying it anymore. And I think that what's different this time around is that the attempt all across the internet is to speak to Syrians. It's not just some American think tank guy who's supporting the revolution in Syria because he wants to break Russia's back or whatever. And it's becoming depoliticized in a sense. It's being decoupled from the geopolitical narrative and more of the human cost of this conflict. And it's more about the human cost of the regime. I think that is where the conversation needs to go. And I think that would be much more beneficial. And we'd like to platform as many Syrian voices as we can, inshallah, because I think they would more effectively tell us what ought to happen to their country. How does your dad feel? How does your father feel about this?
I think my father's very much on his toes. Actually, like I can get to speak to him just before we started this, so I'm looking forward to speaking to him after this. But he obviously he has a lot of fear because my father has lived this. My father has lived a lot of the reign of terror under the Assad regime. And like I said at the beginning, there's always a fear that the Assad regime will come back, and will come back very viciously. But at the same time, there's just this, it all feels very surreal, and I think we're all trying to allow ourselves to be happy, but not be too excited just in case. Because we did that in 2011 and our dreams came crashing down. Obviously, we always kept our faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We always kept our faith in our commitment to justice for our country in self-determination. And so like I said, there are these conflicting feelings where you want to be hopeful and you want to be excited. And what we're seeing is just out of the world. No one expected it to happen. Definitely not in this way and so soon. But at the same time, the Assad regime still does control the airspace. The Assad regime still does have its allies, even if they're being reserved. The Assad regime today killed people in Idlib. It's killed an entire family in Idlib. The Assad regime in Russia yesterday killed, I believe, 20 people. 5 journalists have already been killed. The day prior, about 40 people were killed. And so there are people being killed. Even though the Assad regime is retreating, it's still in the airspace, it's still bombing, and it's targeting civilians. And so there is this fear and this hope that we're trying to balance.
I think that's a fair approach to and an assessment to the situation. But I think you should rejoice and find hope in the fact that the Prophet mentioned the people of Sham. He mentioned them with a lot of dignity, and he granted them a lot of honor. Someone living in South Asia, we've never been mentioned, so I'm sure it's a source of dignity and comfort for the Syrian people, and everybody looks to them for getting themselves out of the situation, inshallah. I can understand your trepidations when it comes to the to any jubilation, for any further liberation or any further victories for the Syrian people. And I can understand that you think that near the end, the Syrian regime will be the most violent or try to be the most violent. I think that there's a bad precedent that's been set in Libya and in Iraq, that when even if it's a dictator, when the leader gets taken out, they get killed very brutally. So that is something that drives and motivates, Putin, for example, or Bashar al-Assad to quite an extent. That if they lose, that they will be hanging from some street pole or street light in somewhere. And that might be the total justice, the actual justice that the Syrian people deserve. But I think that fear motivates a lot of dictators and despots to, grip on to power as hard as they can, and no amount of civilian casualties will deter them. Because if you take, for example, Hafiz's attack on Hama, that's 40,000. That's the actual reported number of casualties in one whole year of the Gaza conflict. And he did that in 3 weeks. He did that in 3 weeks and back in the 80s. So there's no human cost to these people because they see what's happened to dictators in the past. They've seen people play by the rules of the West, like with Gaddafi. They've seen people not play by the rules of the West, like with Saddam. They both ended up pretty brutally murdered. So, what do you think is going to become of the, because these two powers are going to collide, right? The rebel forces and the regime forces. What do you think the resolution is going to look like? Like the Taliban style, where they had a general pardon, they didn't kill anyone, they allowed people to come back to Afghanistan? Or do you think that for the regime, they would have to leave Syria, or they would have to be, tried for their crimes? Because the Taliban, Afghanistan is more of a tribal society. So they had this resolution model. They're fighting in a very similar style, by the way, where they're quickly moving through the areas and leaving behind the administrative staff, the bureaucratic structures intact, as opposed to trying to govern themselves. I've noticed that they're doing a very similar thing to the Taliban. The Taliban announced a general pardon the moment they captured the capital, and they allowed for people to come back to Afghanistan. But they simply announced that you can't participate in government anymore. What do you think is the future? I mean, again, this is asking too much of you, because you're not really leading the rebel factions. But what do you think do you think this is going to go a more reconciliatory route, or do you think this is going to lead to more violence?
I couldn't tell you. I genuinely have no idea. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing several sort of like reactions. Obviously, a lot of Syrians, regardless of whether they're with the rebels or not, they want to see total justice when it comes to the Assad regime. Personally, I don't believe the Assad regime should have anything to do with Syria. They should be completely driven out. I don't believe in Bashar al-Assad necessarily being killed. I believe that he should be trialed. I think that he should be brought to justice in this world and then before the next world, and he definitely will be brought to justice the most by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most just. But I would really like to see him be brought to justice and by Syrians. I don't have my hopes in the international community. I don't have my hopes, particularly with what we've seen in Gaza, but even with Syria in general, like they failed us so much. They failed us completely when it came to Bashar al-Assad, and arguably when it came to Hafiz al-Assad. So I believe that the Assad regime has no right to be involved in Syria in any capacity. And I believe this is shared amongst many of the opposition or many of the people who are anti-Assad. What we've seen over the last few days has been very interesting. Actually, yesterday, HTS issued several statements about the liberated areas and how they're going to be governed. So they issued first, they've been issuing statements towards the Christians. They've been issuing statements towards the Druze communities, where they've been telling them that you will be protected, that no harm will come to you, that there'll be freedom of expression. And then yesterday, they issued a statement towards the Alawis, where they asked of the Alawis to denounce their support, or the Alawi community rather, because there are many Alawis who are also anti-Assad and have been part of the Syrian revolution. But they've asked the Alawi community, by and large, to denounce Bashar al-Assad, and they've mentioned that, we are one nation who should be working together, and we will be working together. And they also admitted that it's not going to be easy. And I think that's a huge sign of maturity, to admit as an opposition that it's not going to be easy, but we're going to try and make this work as a national sort of like a liberation movement. And everything that they're using, they are using very sort of national terms. It's very obvious that they have a very national project that they are trying to work towards. Whether this is PR, whether this is reality, I don't know. But these are the statements that are being issued. And part of it is obviously to build trust amongst the people, because how else are you going to continue liberating if you haven't given people your trust and they haven't given you their trust back? They also issued statements with regards to the liberated areas in HABB, saying that there's going to be a transitional sort of body and period where after a particular period, I can't remember how many weeks they said, they're going to hand it over to local committees and civilian sort of like structures. And so they've said that there will be an insihab, there will be a retreat of kind of like military and soldiers from HTS and from these rebel groups from particular areas in Aleppo, so as to allow people to be led in a civic manner. Again, whether this is going to happen or not, we don't know. We're going to have to see. We are also seeing some tensions amongst the rebel groups themselves, and I think there's also a lot of apprehension when it comes to that. We're seeing some tensions and conflict between HTS and SNA. So SNA are the Turkey-backed rebel group, and HTS are the biggest and the rebel group which is primarily leading this operation. And what we've been seeing is actually, unfortunately, some of the violations that have been committed against civilians, and there have been violations committed against civilians by rebel factions. Some of the violations committed against Kurdish individuals in particular has come from the SNA. A very thuggish behavior. There's been a good number of looting also, just very, very thuggish, immature behavior. Some of it mimics the behavior of the rebels in the earlier years of the revolution, where there was a degree of immaturity when it came to it. Whereas what we're seeing with HTS is we're seeing a lot more sort of discipline. There was an HTS member when Aleppo was liberated, who took down one of the Christmas trees that was in central Aleppo, and immediately the next day, HTS issued a statement saying that it's been restored. They issued a picture to prove it, and then they continued the statement saying that they've disciplined that person to ensure that there is no kind of like bad blood and to show that they have a degree of discipline. And they also seem to have also trained many of their fighters. It's very interesting to see. This definitely has been something that they've been planning for a while, because they've definitely trained their fighters in how to deal with people.
By the way, it's very reminiscent of what the Taliban has achieved. There would be immature actions on the part of an individual fighter, and then they would make a statement, have a redressal for the issue and punish the fighter. This mention of the Alawite community, rebuking the Assad regime. In fact, if I'm not incorrect, I've read somewhere and I've spoken to some people that the Prince Karim Aga Khan, who is the head of the Aga Khani community, which is the Alawite Ismaili community in Pakistan and Central Asia, he helped negotiate between the HTS and the Alawite community in Syria. And I think that would be very hopeful that you would have minorities like the Druze.
In 2024?
Just now, yes. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I did not read that.
So Prince Karim Aga Khan is this. He's like a philanthropist, billionaire character who is the head of the Alawite. He's the patriarch, the religious patriarch, and community leader of the Alawite Ismaili community. They're called Aga Khanis.
Yeah, we have a university in London, which is the Aga Khan University.
That's from his grants. He makes universities and hospitals everywhere. He's a fascinating character. Pakistan has had a decent relationship with the Alawite minority, which are the Bohris, and the Aga Khanis. They have enjoyed a high status in Pakistan and India, generally in South Asia. But I think that we hope that Syria will have the best future with regards to this as well, because these minorities make up the mosaic that is Syrian society. The Druze people, the Christian people.
And we're all Syrians ultimately, and we're working towards a Syrian state.
And you mentioning the fact that the Turk-backed militia has a bit of an anti-Kurd attitude. I think it's a given. Turkey's been quite motivated.
There's been a tit for tat. So you have the SNA sort of like partaking in these very thuggish behavior, and then you also have the SDF. The SDF have also been killing, looting, not keeping to their commitments. They've killed a number of civilians already, and so it's very. I think this is one of the things that it's very difficult for us to see, because again, we would want as much as possible the liberation of our towns to be done in a just manner, and not to be done by people who violate, the sanctity of the human and violate the basic just human decency and adab towards other people, regardless of whether you agree with them or not. And particularly when they're civilians. When they're civilians should never be harmed and should never be touched. But what we're seeing is with SDF and with SNA, very pathetic, very thuggish behavior. And this is already causing tensions between the rebel groups and between HTS and SNA. I hope it's going to be sorted. I hope that SNA will kind of like bring in more disciplinary measures and will actually contribute properly to this unification of what we're seeing so far. And I hope it won't end up being something that will cause detriment to the movement.
So what do you make of the excitement in Western media for the liberation that's happening right now? if you turn on your cynical brain for a second, what do you think the Western media is? Why are they so excited about? Is it just that they see it as another defeat for Putin potentially? Whereas in the Ukrainian front in theater, he's been winning, or Russia has been victorious generally. Do you think it's just a way to slight the Russian regime, or do they have greater hopes to stabilize the region, or do they see something as a potential benefit to their ally Israel? What do you think that is all about?
Mm, so the Western media, to be fair, has for many years taken on the Syrian narrative, taken on the Syrian people's narrative. That did shift a little bit after ISIS came in, but they always did try to center the Syrian civilians' narrative. And that was because it was very easy to refer to Bashar al-Assad as a dictator, simply because he was a dictator, and also because if we actually look at the context of this, the Syrian revolution didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the Arab Spring. It came out of the MENA revolutions, which primarily were perceived in a very positive light in Western media. Obviously, with Syria, there are complexities. So because Russia is involved, yes, you do have a point. There is definitely that angle where they emphasize Russia's occupation of Syria. They emphasize Russia's foreign involvement in Syria, and they definitely do want to see a defeat for Russia. But I don't think it always mirrors or mimics the foreign policy of those countries themselves. Because if we actually look at the statements that have been issued by the US, and if we actually look at the statements issued by various Western officials, they're actually quite worried about the escalation, and they're calling for a de-escalation.
Right, because you had a normalization of the Assad regime with the Arab regimes recently, and you even had potential normalization with Turkey. Where do you think that whole process is going now? Do you think it's they've been thrown for a spin like the 7th of October? Do you think things?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you?
Absolutely. And do you know what? Good for them. Like they brought this upon themselves. And I hate to use this term, but I think as they all wanted to stabilize the region, they got tired of Syria. Syria became too much for them. It was a stalemate for a long time. It was a stalemate. That doesn't mean that people aren't being killed. People have still been, but have still be like people have been killed every single day over the last 4 years. But it reached a stalemate because the opposition couldn't progress, and the Assad regime had regained some of its power, particularly with Russia and Iran. And this is prior to October 7th. And this is also, this is prior to October 7th, and prior to, obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So generally, like the GCC countries, Saudi, the UAE, Jordan, who was spearheading Iraq, who was spearheading this normalization. Do you know what? I intended to make Hajj last year because I began working with my organization who were quite critical, but subhanAllah, I wasn't accepted. And now I'm just praying that somehow I'll still be able to go.
I've made Hajj, alhamdulillah. So if you wanna skip this, it's perfectly fine.
But what I have done is in Ramadan of 2023, when I knew that I was going to join the organization I'm working with, I did the Umrah in Ramadan in the last 10 days with the intention of Hajj, just in case I can't do Hajj. So.
May Allah bless you. That's always a big question. The other colleagues of mine, they joke around on the podcast. They say, we haven't made Hajj, and he's made Hajj, so he's very bold about Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries. But you know.
But, the GCC countries, they have normalized. That's the fact. There's nothing that I'm saying is out of the ordinary. They've normalized, and because they took that decision. They assumed that they wanted Syria. So Syria was an unresolved conflict, and they just wanted to brush it aside. And now they're realizing that you can't brush aside an unresolved conflict because it's unresolved. It needs to be resolved, and they didn't care to resolve it. They weren't putting any political will in it to resolve it. They instead decided to normalize with one of the most brutal dictators of this century in that region. And then we saw the USA, to a certain extent, also trying to kind of like see if, trying to make steps towards normalization. We've seen Italy normalize with the Assad regime. So it's not just the Arab countries in the GCC, it's also some of the European countries. We've seen also ministers from the EU go back to Syria. They're in Damascus right now. Like, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. It's incredibly unjust and heinous. So Assad regime, I can't remember what your question was about normalization, actually. What was your question?
The question was, what do you make of the media frenzy? And do you think that then we subsequently followed up with how do you think that the Gulf regimes have been thrown for a spin, like with the 7th of October? Or do you think
I
that
think
this
so.
was expected on the cards? Was this on the table? Do you think people were
No
caught?
one, no one expected this in any capacity, even Turkey. No one expected this.
Right.
And I don't think it actually has any support. Like, if you actually look at the statements, like I said, a lot of people are calling for de-escalation. Some haven't issued any statements yet. Some people have mentioned brief statements where they're saying that nothing will be resolved in Syria without a political resolution. And so they're trying to, which means de-escalation. Um, Even Russia and Iran, who are Assad's allies, like Russia issued a statement saying that, the Syrian regime has its right to its own sovereignty, but it also was reserved. And as we've seen, Russia's actions so far have been quite reserved. They haven't actually moved more ammunition and they haven't made more movements into Syria. So, yeah, I don't think anyone was expecting this.
Right. What do you think you will hope to see in the next few upcoming days or weeks, inshallah? Um, where do you think Bashar is going to go? Do you think he's going to go to Tehran or Moscow?
I don't think Bashar al-Assad is gonna go down without a very fierce and vicious fight. Um, I think if Hama is going to be completely liberated, the next two cities, which are going to be Homs and Damascus, and also potentially Daraa is going to be very important. They're going to be very, very difficult, and I believe the most difficult will be Homs before Damascus, because Hezbollah is still in Homs, and a lot of the Lebanese refugees ended up going to Homs. They have a lot more fighters or potential fighters over there. Um, we're seeing, Yani, I feel like it's going to go down very viciously. I think you asked me about what I hope to see, right? I really hope to see a consolidation of the rebel rule over these areas, and to not see any more retreats, or to not see retreats, if that makes sense, and to actually begin seeing their governance sort of play out, so that we can all be reassured ultimately as to how this liberation is going to play out, or how this first phase of liberation is going to be played out, with the full knowledge that we all know this isn't total liberation. And ultimately, many of us want a Syrian state, which is a lot more democratizing. Many of us want a Syrian state where all elements of Syrian society are going to be represented, and it's going to be a civil state as opposed to a military state. And so I think that's what I want to see. I want to see what's going to happen in Aleppo, what's going to happen in Idlib, what's going to happen in Hama, inshallah, if it's fully liberated. And hopefully also the bigger hope is to see the rest of Syria liberated, though I'm very well aware that that will be a much more difficult fight for the rebel groups going ahead. It makes sense to me that the Assad regime might want to hold on to Damascus and Latakia. I don't know if we're going to see a fall of Damascus. I really hope we will. I think that would be incredible if we did. But again, it's too early to put our hopes up that high.
You're right. We can all hope and pray that Damascus will be liberated, and inshallah we can see a free Syrian civil country that I would love to visit at some point. It's always been a dream to come to Syria, but now it seems, it gets worse day by day. What do you have to say to, Assad fanboys, Hezbollah fanboys, Qasem Soleimani fanboys in the comments? Most of them are going to be Pakistani, and they're going to have a lot of choice words about you and your mother and your father. What do you have to say to them?
What do I have to say to them? Just, I think, to look into their humanity. I think just before you begin pontificating in your very myopic geopolitical sort of figment of your imagination, it's very important for you to perceive the person in front of you as a human and understand their agency to it. Regardless of whether you agree with them or not, yani, ultimately, we're speaking about humans. We're speaking about Syria. So, unfortunately, many people see Syria as just a supply weapon route to Hezbollah because they're viewing Syria through the myopic lens of Iran, which sees Syria as just a strategic location. Syria is the home for 22 million people. Syria is the home for 12 million displaced people right now all over the world. Syria is the home of 600,000 souls, which the Assad regime killed. Syria is a country just like Pakistan is a country. Syria is a country with people who have such complex lives, people who have such complex relationships, people who come from all different ideological backgrounds and faith backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds. It was very, very much a melting pot. And Syria also is a very historical and a very significant and a very beautiful country, and we have a right to that. So I just want people to think of that. You know, when I speak of Syria, I don't care about people's politics. I care about me being able to go back to Syria. When I speak about Syria, I care about me seeing my parents who haven't seen Syria for 44 years, my parents who have been threatened and intimidated, my parents who have had their family members killed, my parents who they themselves have been incarcerated. They have a right to go back to their home cities and their homeland. So I want people to just imagine this and try to put yourself in our shoes. It's very easy to dismiss, because if you haven't been in that situation, if you don't know what it means to be displaced, if you don't know what it means to be a refugee, if you don't know what it means to not live in your hometown. I'm a Syrian who's never been to Syria. I'm a Syrian who, this isn't about me. I'm not a victim in any capacity. This absolutely isn't about me. But if we were to take my life, I'm a Syrian. I speak Syrian. I was brought up in a very Syrian household, and I carry the traumas of my parents. It's why I've been active on Syria for the last 13 years and arguably even before that, because I'm a Syrian who's never been to Syria and I have a right to that. So I just want people to perhaps leave that in their conceptualization before they begin coming and carrying foreign agendas, or, you know, using the words of another foreign power against an actual Syrian.
Yeah,
who has
that
a
makes
right
a lot
to
of
them.
sense, but like, you know, you're a Zionist, Takfiri, Wahhabi, and I don't care what you have to say. So with that, I'm gonna have to leave. This is too much for me. You're too much of a Wahhabi, Zionist, whatever. You're all of it. No, I'm really pulling your leg. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. I think the way you put it just now, I think it's very appropriate that it's not just a geopolitical issue. It's, you know, Syria. There's all these complex lives, people with hopes and dreams. They want to live there. They want to go back home. They want to celebrate their culture and history. It's not just a, you know, shipping route for Iran and their weapons and Hezbollah.
We want to be with our families. I want to meet my aunt.
Right, fair enough.
You know, I haven't seen her in, the first and last time I saw her was the year 2000.
Subhanallah.
It's as simple as that. I want to be able to visit my grandparents' graves. I don't know my grandparents. My grandparents passed away when both my parents were in exile, and my parents never got closure. There was an interview that my father did in 2011 when the revolution started, and I remember because I was sat there, like the woman came, she was filming, and she asked my father a question. She told him, if you were to return to Homs, where would the first place you go? Like, what would be the first place that you would go to? And my father's response, as he said it with very teary eyes, was my mother's grave. Because he'd never seen his mother after he left. His mother passed away after he had left Homs. Never saw her, and always carried that guilt, you know? And I want to be able to take my father to his mother's grave.
Inshallah. May Allah give you that closure and your family, that sense of stability in your own homes. Thank you, Razan, for coming. My salam to you, your father, your mother, your family, and to all the free people of Syria, inshallah. And one day I hope to greet them as brothers and sisters, not through social media, but in Syria, in their homes,
Inshallah.
To see what they offer me in delights and food, and to visit all the historic places.
Absolutely, inshallah.
To visit all the historic places and to walk, the streets of Syria, inshallah, in our lifetimes.
Inshallah.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much for your time, Razan.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for having me.
Where can people follow you?
I'm on both Twitter and Instagram on Razan Speaks.
We'll put that in the thing, and they can follow you on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter is banned in Pakistan.
But like no profanities, no insults. Like
Right.
you want to insult,
So if you support Hezbollah and if you support Iran, you need to find this woman and you need to tell her she's a Takfiri Wahhabi, and I'm just the messenger. Don't shoot me. No, thank you for your time, Razan. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
Alaikum salam.